So with that being said, we have with us here Dr. Saifedean Ammous. I'm sure most of you are familiar with him, but if you are not, he is the author of the Bitcoin Standard, the Fiat Standard, and his forthcoming book, which I'm very excited for, as I'm sure many of you are as well, his Principles of Economic textbook. And with that being said, Dr. Ammous, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Rich, and thanks to the Austrian Economics Discord conference. This is my first time using Discord. As long as I'm just supposed to keep speaking into the mic, I think I can handle it. If there's anything else I need to do, please do find a way to communicate to me and let me know. So today I think on the topic of money, the state, and inflation, I think I would like to talk about my one of the topics that I like to keep harping on about, a horse that I keep whipping repeatedly, which is the link between government money, hard money, easy money, and time preference. It's something that I've mentioned in the Bitcoin Standard. There was a whole chapter on time preference in the Bitcoin Standard, and I mentioned it as well in the Fiat Standard. There's a whole chapter about it in the Fiat Standard, and there's a whole chapter about it in my forthcoming book, Principles of Economics, which is now almost done. I've written about 15 chapters. There's 1 or 2 chapters left. I'm not sure if it's going to be 1 or 2 chapters, but it's basically coming to an end. I'm finalizing it now. So this is a topic that I find enormously fascinating, and it's a very Austrian topic because it combines several perspectives that are very Austrian, that are things that are spoken about extensively by Austrians, and which mainstream economists generally have no idea about or don't like to bother their little brains with thinking much about these things. So the topic of time preference obviously is something that Austrians like to discuss extensively, whereas mainstream economists, they just take it as it's just something that leads to the discount rate, which is just the number that you put you put into the test exam questions and get a good grade. They don't give much thought to the determinants of the discount rate and the implications of the discount rate being high or low, and the broader implications of this enormously important metric. And of course, the other aspect is the hardness of money, which is something that mainstream economists think about even less, because obviously mainstream economics is usually little more than just government propaganda out there to justify government control of the money supply. And if you wanted to control the money supply, the last thing you want the pesky peasants talking about and thinking about is how hard that money is and how much the supply increases versus the stockpile. What is the supply growth rate? Why should the supply growth rate be low, or why should it be high? And why is our money growing so quickly? These are not the sort of questions that your mainstream economists are preoccupied with. So that makes it all the more pressing for us as Austrians to focus on these questions. And so in my work, I've and in my reading of Austrian economics, I've come across the concept of time preference, obviously in the work of Mises and Rothbard, but I think perhaps the most powerful and most relevant discussion of time preference is in chapter 1 of Hoppe's Democracy, the God That Failed, which I think is an excellent treatment of the topic. And in Hoppe's book, Democracy That Fails, the book primarily is about democracy and the failings of the democratic political system in the 20th century. And it's the first chapter. The topic of the first chapter of the book is democracy and time preference. And Hoppe makes the very powerful argument that democracy is a way to raise society's time preference. It's a high time preference way of governing, and it's something that leads to societal increases in time preference with devastating implications. And of course, one of the most powerful ideas in this chapter is the idea that when you have a king, the king expects to be in power for a very long time and expects his children and grandchildren and many generations to be in power. So they are likely to care about the well-being of their country generations into the future, because they want to make sure that there's something nice for their descendants to be able to rule over. Whereas when you have a democratic system in which you're getting rid of the ruler every 4 years or every 8 years or 10 years or whatever it is, each ruler, every new ruler knows that they are only there for a brief period of time. They don't expect to be there for a very long time, and they don't expect to have their kids be in power in the future. Their rule is very uncertain. And so, therefore, there's a very high level of uncertainty about where they are going to be in the future. And so, therefore, they're much more likely to discount the future. And so, when they're managing the country, they manage the country like there is no tomorrow, or that there isn't, like there is no 10 years from now. Because life 10 years from now is going to be very different, most likely, if you're a democratic leader. Today, you're president, you can do whatever you want. You can take whatever you want. You have the power to secure yourself financially and your children and secure your grandchildren financially by simply exercising your power today. Whereas 10 years from now, you're going to likely be back as a regular citizen. You have no power and you are the subject of other people having power. So you need to pillage as quickly as you can, and you need to secure yourself as quickly as you can. Whereas, and that encourages all manner of high time preference decision making. And I think this is the 20th century, as Hoppe explains, has been an enormous open air experiment in what happens if we raise the time preference of everybody in power everywhere. And the consequences have been absolutely devastating, bloody, murderous, and enormously destructive. I think the amount of bloodshed and destruction that has taken place in the 20th century cannot be separated from the fact that leaders of the 20th century have a high time preference. But in Hoppe's book, he focuses primarily on the aspect of democracy and the role of governance. And he talks about several factors that influence time preference. He discusses the rate of taxation. When taxes rise, then you're more likely to discount the future because you're not likely to keep much of your money, so you might as well just spend it today. And you don't have a reliable way for providing for the future. And I think what Bitcoin has allowed me to do, and watching how Bitcoin has emerged and watching the way that Bitcoiners have dealt with Bitcoin over time, I think has really given me a lot of confidence in my thesis, which is that that's really, I would say, the punchline of this talk and the punchline of my discussion on time preference is basically that the hardness of money is like a control knob for time preference. And here, of course, I draw heavily on the work of Guido Hülsmann, whose book on the ethics of money production and deflation and liberty discuss the cultural consequences of fiat money. And I think this is an enormously important topic because it's inflation leads to very serious economical and social and moral implications. And so that, for me, writing a book about Bitcoin in 2017, looking back right now, it's almost inexplicable for me why I would choose to have an entire chapter on time preference. Because back then, very few people who knew about time preference knew about Bitcoin, and very few people who knew about Bitcoin knew about time preference. The connection didn't seem obvious. And this argument that I'm making right now would have seemed a lot less compelling to most people. And I think in retrospect, it strikes me as very odd that I chose to just put it front and center of the book. But for some reason I did. And I think it's definitely hit a nerve, both among Austrians and among Bitcoiners, and led to a lot of Austrians becoming curious about Bitcoin, a lot of Bitcoiners becoming more curious about Austrian economics. But I think there's a very strong case to be made that the hardness of money is like a control knob for time preference. Because all of the topics that Hoppe discusses, you can also apply them specifically to the concept of the hardness of money. When money is hard, remember from the perspective of Austrian economics, the reason that time preference is positive is because the future is uncertain. Ultimately, we all are going to die at some point, and And that's really the key point. We don't know when we're going to be dying. So every moment is uncertain. You could die any moment. Anyone can drop dead at any point in time. And therefore, every point in the future has uncertainty attached to it. It may never arrive. And even if it does arrive, even if you're still alive at a particular point into the future, the things that you have, the things that you count on, might not be there. So therefore, there's always a discount on the future, simply because of the fact that the future just might not be there. You always prioritize the present over the future because the future is here. The present is theoretical. Sorry, the present is here. It's real. Whereas the future is theoretical and it's vague. It may never materialize. So the way that I think about it is that human civilization has been the process of lowering the uncertainty in the future, of trying to manage and lower the uncertainty into the future. That has developed along with, and that has led to the lowering of our time preference. And so, as Hoppe says, the process of human civilization is the process of the lowering of time preference. Lowering of time preference is what allows for the initiation of the process of civilization. Once we start developing the ability to delay gratification and to prioritize the future. Well, I shouldn't say prioritize because we still discount the future, but to discount the future less and less by sacrificing from the present in order to provide for the future, we start thinking about the future, we start saving, we start delaying gratification, and therefore we start providing for the future. And that is what allows for accumulation of capital. So the only reason we can get capital in the first place, the only reason we can accumulate any capital or employ any capital in the process of economic production is because we lower our time preference and we increase our provision for the future. So you lower your time preference, you forego present consumption, and so you're left with a surplus that you don't consume, which you can employ in production. And that's what time preference, that's what the lowering of time preference unleashes. So what I argue is that effectively, and I say this, and I flesh this out in more detail in the Fiat Standard and in Principles of Economics, is that you can't even understand the process of human civilization without reference to the development of money. In other words, the lowering of time preference happens because of the development of money as a store of value. As we develop the ability to store our wealth into the future, we start off first by storing non-perishable goods. We then maybe develop into capital goods and durable goods. These become the way in which we save for the future. Instead of consuming something, we preserve it for the future. But then our ability to lower our time preference is inextricably linked to the goodness of this medium of saving, what we use as a medium of saving. So as long as we're using economic goods as media of savings, then our time preference is not going to continue to drop indefinitely because these things aren't very good at providing for the future. There's only so much grain that you can save for the next year. There's only so much capital that you can save. Capital can depreciate and it can lose its value, and it has a lot of risks over time. So therefore, once we develop money and once we have a form of wealth and saving that is exceptionally good at maintaining its value for the future, and that is also very liquid, which means that it can be exchanged for whatever good that you want, meaning that you don't have to save the grains that you're going to be eating next year. If you save money, you can then next year you can decide whether you need the grains or whether you need something else. So once we develop money, we essentially turbocharge our ability to save for the future, and we therefore turbocharge our ability to lower our time preference and the incentive to lower our time preference. Effectively, we decrease the uncertainty of the future by being able to hold money. And here, there's the great paper by Hoppe on the yield from money held reconsidered, or on why people hold money. And ultimately, people hold money because of uncertainty. And so, because of uncertainty, we hold money, and that helps us reduce the uncertainty of the future. And as Mises argues, if there was no uncertainty about the future, and if we knew exactly all of our future expenditures, then we would not need money. We could just time all of our expenditures and all of our income in a way that ensures that we have all of the income coming in exactly as it's spent, and we don't need to hold on to money. But because the future is uncertain, we do need to hold on to money. And so money helps us reduce the uncertainty of the future by providing us with, by allowing us to provide this very liquid media of exchange for the future. And so I think the development of money was instrumental in the lowering of time preference. The better our money became, the more we were able to hold on to it, the more value it stored into the future, and the better, the more it incentivized us to lower our time preference and provide for the future. Ultimately, your ability to save and delay gratification is inextricably linked to how good your options for saving for the future are. And so historically, we see human civilization has advanced as our money became harder and harder over time. And that makes perfect sense from a praxeological perspective. When you're able to save into the future in the hard money, you're going to act in a way that discounts the future less and less. It's going to lower your time preference more and more. And so if you look at the book History of Interest Rates, 5,000 year history of interest rates, I think it's by Sidney Homer and Richard Silla, I think the name of the second author is. Silla and Homer, they wrote a 5,000 year history of interest rates, basically collecting data on interest rates throughout history. We see that generally there's been a 5,000 year decline in interest rates throughout human history. Well, yes, there have been periods of spikes in interest rates, when there's a famine and when there's a war and when there are bad things happening, interest rates spike up, and these are unfortunately all too frequent throughout human history. Yet, as civilization advances, we see interest rates drop. And of course, from the Austrian perspective, the determinant of interest rates is time preference. And so historically, we see time preference is declining, we see interest rate is declining, and we see that also the hardness of money is increasing. We're constantly moving on from one money to another based on its hardness, and the monies themselves, the more we use them, the harder they become. So a few thousand years ago, people used all kinds of different things as money: seashells, salt, glass beads, etc., etc. But over time, money tended towards silver and gold, and those are the two hardest commodities that are naturally occurring. And then even by the end of the 19th century, even silver was mostly demonetized, and the whole world was practically on a gold standard by the end of the 19th century. And at that point, basically the pinnacle of human civilization, probably at the turn of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, interest rates, the lowest interest rate then was 2.5%. That was the interest rate for the Bank of England. The lowest interest rate historically recorded in the 5,000 year study by Homer and Silla was at that point, at the beginning of the 20th century. So we'd constantly been in this process where we moved toward a harder and harder money, as I described in the Bitcoin standard in more detail, and we're constantly lowering our interest rate. Those two things I do not think are coincidental. I think human action is the driver here. And as our money becomes harder, and over time, the money itself, even gold itself, becomes harder and harder over time because we accumulate larger and larger stockpiles. And so therefore, new production becomes less and less inflationary. Even as we get better at producing it, the market becomes more liquid for gold and the stockpiles increase. And so therefore, it continues to incentivize people to save more and more, and therefore brings interest rates down. And that effectively is the process of human civilization, and it was going swimmingly up until the beginning of the 20th century, when humanity decided to press the self-destruct button, which is a big green button labeled fiat. And that's when things started to go badly in all of these aspects. So we see the hardness of money essentially decreased enormously. So historically, gold's supply increases around 1.5% to 2% per year. The fiat monetary system If you look at the last 60 years, from 1960 to 2020, and I run the numbers in the fiat standard, we see that the average or the total global money supply, the total fiat money supply globally, increased at around 14% per year. So we did a 10x increase in the annual rate of increase of the money supply in the 20th century. Somewhere between 1914 and 1960. We went from 1.5% increase per year of the money supply to 15% increase per year in the money supply. And so with that, people's ability to save is massively compromised. And with that, the ability to provide future is massively compromised. And therefore, the future decline, most future increases, there are if doing human is say that it is hyperbolic, but I really don't think it is hyperbole to say this is truly reversing the process of human civilization. The process of human civilization, as I was describing it, is increase in delayed gratification, the lowering of time preference, the lowering of interest rates, and the growth in capital accumulation, and the growth in savings, and the increasing hardness of money is what drives all of that. Now, 10x the supply increase of money, and suddenly you've undone the infrastructure that makes human civilization possible. Now people can no longer save. Because people can no longer save, they start discounting the future heavily. Because they discount the future heavily, that leads to an entire process of decivilization. Instead of providing for the future, people become more short-term focused. So we see this reflected in everything in the 20th century. And in the fiat standard, I get into this in detail. You see it reflected in architecture. In the 19th century, in the 18th century, architecture was built to last. Today, architecture is essentially disposable. People don't build houses that they want to survive for 100 years, even though technology that we have today would make these things a lot easier to build today than they were 100 years ago. Yet we build homes that are meant to survive for 20, 30 years because that's as far ahead as anybody can think these days. And we see it in all manner of social and moral aspects of the decline in morality and in the growth in uncivilized behavior, the growth in criminality. All of these things, we see them as essentially the people have just normalized the idea that this is what happens with time. That we're just supposed to accept that crime goes up over time, that people become less and less civil over time. But I don't think that is inevitable. I think that's just a product of an increase in time preference caused by a decrease in the hardness of money and a decrease in our ability to provide for the future. And I think the implications are, it's impossible to understate these. It's impossible to really argue that this has not been a big deal because we've seen it happen over a century. Obviously, throughout the century, it's varied from place to place. So if you've lived in Switzerland or Sweden or Denmark or the US, or most European countries or Japan, you've had relatively low annual supply growth rate of the money supply, as opposed to some of the more bold monetary experiments of the 20th century, where they've had several instances of hyperinflation and very frequent high inflation. But in fact, if you look at what happens during the cases of hyperinflation, if you look at, say, Adam Ferguson's book, When Money Dies, on the Weimar hyperinflation, or if you look at the news from places like Venezuela or Lebanon or Zimbabwe, in those places, you hear about how people behave under hyperinflation, and then you just see that this is basically no different from what people with low inflation do. It's just if you live in the US or Europe, in the places where they have 10%, 15% annual money supply growth rather than 50 and 100, You're just going through hyperinflation in slow motion. It's the same kind of process. The criminality, the lack of civility, the high time preference behavior, the moral degeneracy, all of these things, the high consumerism, the inability to save, the inability to think of the future, the people shifting from making long-term plans for their life to just living day to day. That's, again, to go back to my control knob argument, that's really what inflation does. And so when you turn the control knob of the hardness of money all the way down, when your money is not hard at all, as is the case in Lebanon and Venezuela today, then everybody is very high time preference. Everybody is really focused only about making it to the end of the week, because it's very difficult to make it to the end of the week and the end of the month, and it's very difficult to think about anything beyond that. What are you going to do? How are you going to think about what's going to happen in 5 years from now? Because you have no easy way for providing for yourself in 5 years from now. So you discount the future very heavily. Well, if that control knob is turned down, but not to the level of Lebanon and Venezuela, if it's turned down to the level of, say, Brazil or Turkey, where it's just a slow simmering boil, you see the same kind of behavior in Lebanon and Venezuela, but at a lower rate. And then if it's at around 5, 10, 15%, as it is in the US and some European countries and so on, then it's still the same thing, but it's going there at a slower rate. But the tragic thing about it, of course, is that it's a one-way slide. Like it's a one-way slide down toward the destruction of civilization. And of course, a lot of people like to think of places like Venezuela and Lebanon as being, random third world shitholes that are uncivilized, and that's why they get hyperinflation. And that's not really the case. Venezuela was one of the richest countries in the world in the 1950s. Lebanon was one of the richest countries in the world in the 1960s and 70s. It's a highly educated population, and they have a highly advanced banking system. They were on the gold standard in Lebanon up until the mid-1970s. They were one of the last countries in the world that was on a gold standard. The currency was almost fully backed by gold up until the mid-1970s. It was known as the Switzerland of the Middle East because it had a banking system that was very attractive to people from all over the world, not just from the Middle East. A lot of people wanted to send their money to the banks here in Lebanon because they had great banking institutions. They had a currency that was backed by gold, and it was a pretty civilized place. Then you turn that control knob of the hardness of money, you reduce the hardness of money to zero, or you raise the inflation rate to over 100% per year, and then it begins to look like just any of these shitholes that you see on your TV, just massively dysfunctional country. So the lesson here is that it can happen anywhere. You can just turn that dial. And you see it in Germany. Germany was one of the world's most advanced industrial economies before World War I, and then after World War I and the Weimar Republic, and with the hyperinflation there, you saw the complete collapse and destruction of the German economy and German society. So I think it's a pretty compelling thing, and I think it's no exaggeration to think of fiat money as a short circuit or a hack in the functioning of human civilization. The algorithm that makes human civilization possible is you behave in the civilized way in which pretty much all cultures teach their children to behave. And you don't kill, you don't steal, you save for the future, you accumulate wealth, you don't spend everything that you have, you behave like a civilized human being, and hopefully you will reap the rewards of that in the long run. If you behave well, you're going to be much better off than if you behave like an animal. And a key component of making that algorithm work is your ability to save, is the idea that, okay, I'm not going to spend all of my money on momentary pleasures of today. I'm going to save for the future. And a key ingredient of making this work is the fact that if you save, you will be rewarded in the future. You will reap the rewards of saving money for the future. But when that is short-circuited, when you save that money and then that money is effectively taken away from you because the people who control the money supply can print more of it. Therefore, they devalue your money, and then they finance all of the stupid things that they want to do. You've short-circuited the algorithm for civilization, because now the people who behave in the good way, in the pro-civilization manner, they're being robbed, and they're being told, sucks to be you, you've lost, all of your money's gone, and that money's going to go to the high time preference people who are not behaving in a civilized way, who are stealing that money and using it to finance their destruction of this country or other countries. You know, the inflationary spending, whether it's domestic or foreign, or in war, or in corrupt cronies. It's essentially it's punishing responsible pro-civilization behavior and subsidizing degenerate, violent, and anti-civilizational behavior. And so you can't expect a civilization to survive that process for a very long time. And I think this is the depressing reality of the last century. If we look around us in the world, you know, if you don't have this kind of Austrian perspective, if you don't understand the importance of money and the importance of sound money, if you don't see the importance of limiting the power of government, and you don't see the problems with government having limitless spending, then it might seem to you like the 20th century was just inevitable. Like all of these processes that we saw in the 20th century were just inevitable. But if you see it from the Austrian perspective, you see that it's not inevitable. It's because we basically installed malware into our civilizational infrastructure, and we've switched to this form of money that is destructive of civilization. And the really depressing thing is that it's been going on for a century. It's caused an enormous amount of suffering. But perhaps, you know, the really hopeful thing is that we now have a purely technological solution for this problem, and this is Bitcoin. And this is why I think Bitcoin is such an amazing invention, because it strikes right at the heart of the problem. It shoots evil at its root. It doesn't hack at the branches of the fiat cancer. It goes straight to the root of the problem. We can sit and pontificate for centuries about all the problems of fiat money, but the common thing that drives them all is the ability of a small section of society to destroy the currency to finance their spending. What drives all of this is that most people have to work for their money, but some people are able to just make their money out of thin air. And that's what Bitcoin strikes at. And that's really, for me, what is so powerful about Bitcoin, because it is a technology that is basically inflation proof. It's Keynesian proof. There's nothing that Keynesians can do about it. There's no way that they can find a way to make Bitcoin more inflationary. And so Bitcoin continues to be the only haven for anybody who wants to get out of inflation. It's really the only way that you can store your wealth in something that you know for sure will not be inflated. And you could say gold is similar to that. In a sense, it is. However, realistically, you are saving if you save in physical gold, your physical gold is essentially dysfunctional as money in a modern digital economy where information and economic goods travel across the world at the speed of light, essentially, as data, whereas your money is extremely clunky and slow. It's difficult to send the money at the speed of the information and the speed of economic value around the world. And so therefore, your gold needs to work. In order for it to work as money, it needs to be centralized in financial institutions that can move it around. And it's this centralization, of course, that got us into this problem in the first place. The fact that all the gold in every country was centralized in a few banks and then in one central bank is what allowed governments to capture that gold, confiscate that gold, and replace it with their credit as a form of money, and then essentially neuter the monetary role of gold. And this is where Bitcoin is different, because it's not dependent on these things. It's not dependent on centralized institutions for its clearance. So this is my kind of hopeful message of ending that if there's any way to reverse this catastrophic rise in time preference that fiat has afflicted us with over the last century, it's Bitcoin. If you have any other ideas, I'm open to listening to them, but I think that's the only shot we got. And that's it. Thank you.
A few questions here for you. The first one here is, a lot of people have said that the technology behind Bitcoin is good, but Bitcoin itself is a bad idea. How would you respond to show that both of these are actually good?
The technology behind Bitcoin is just Bitcoin. Bitcoin doesn't do anything else. It's like, I mean, a nutcracker just cracks nuts. And so the technology behind it is just the cracking of nuts. And the technology behind Bitcoin is just a very elaborate contraption that allows us to have a form of money whose supply can't be increased and whose movement can't be controlled by anybody else. And realistically, this only works in the case of Bitcoin. I don't think there's a single digital currency other than Bitcoin that can realistically, with a straight face, make the claim that they have achieved Bitcoin, what Bitcoin has achieved. Every single other digital currency has a kill switch. Every single other digital currency has a person behind it who controls it. So the idea that blockchain technology exists separately from Bitcoin, I think is a fallacy, and it's an idea that's going to die. All of the other digital currencies are essentially cargo cult imitations. So, when these isolated tribes, I think it was in the Pacific, when they first saw airplanes come along, they were astonished by it, and they got a bunch of tree twigs and they made them look like an airplane, and then they expected those little contraptions of airplanes to start performing like an airplane. This is exactly what digital currencies other than Bitcoin do, because without being the first, and without being decentralized, and without having no authority in charge, you cannot achieve the only purpose of Bitcoin, which is that it is money that isn't controlled by anybody. And so that's why the second biggest currency has changed its inflation schedule several times. All the rest of them are very trivial to change for anybody. And so if any of them ever does gain any kind of traction, it's pretty trivial for governments to take it over and then make them inflationary.
Next question here is that you've often mentioned Julian Simon's work. Which areas of economics can Austrians most benefit from by reading Simon, and how have you incorporated Simon into your own textbook?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like Simon. Simon's probably my. You could almost say that he's almost an honorary Austrian, although he probably didn't identify as an Austrian himself. But he was very free market, and he, as far as I can tell, he didn't have most or any of the major failings of the kind of Chicago economists, which particularly pertain to money, monetary economics. But yeah, I think what's most interesting about Simon's work for me is his focus on time and his idea that human time is the ultimate resource. And I think in Austrian economics, we understand the concept of scarcity as being the starting principle of economics. But I think Julian Simon really strengthens this Austrian approach of, Menger says value comes from scarcity. The reason we value things is because they're scarce. But really, things themselves are not technically scarce, because we can always keep making more of anything. The limit on how much we have of anything is our time. And that's where the scarcity really is. So it's really human time that is the root of scarcity. And I think situating economics entirely as not the scarcity of goods, not the scarcity of iron and gold and nickel and oil and apples and oranges, the scarcity of the human time that can be converted into apples and oranges and nickel and gold and oil and all of those things, I think is a more powerful restatement of economics. And so that's something that I do in my next book, in Principles of Economics, that I introduce the idea of economics and value and the concept of human action. And then I have a whole chapter on time based on Julian Simon, explaining the idea of scarcity as being a product of limited time. And I think it's quite complementary and to the Austrian perspective rather than being opposed to it in any way. I think it's Simon's work is very powerful and very useful. I recommend reading his book, The Ultimate Resource.
Next question here is, do you think that Satoshi was a Rothbardian?
I think when I first was into Bitcoin, I did have this kind of idea that he was a Rothbardian and this was his attempt to tear down central banking. But to be honest, as I've dug into it more and more, you look at his readings, I think he was almost certainly not very knowledgeable about Austrian economics. He never indicates that he's read Austrian economics, or he's never indicated that he's very familiar with the Austrian critique of fiat money. I think, and that's not necessarily bad news. We shouldn't be sad as Austrians about it. On the contrary, it's a compliment, I think, to Austrian economics, because what we see here is that effectively he was just a brilliant engineer, and he thought about this from an engineering perspective. And without having read Rothbard or Mises, he arrived at the idea that if you wanted to make the perfect money, if you were an engineer designing a money from scratch, there's no reason for the supply of money to continue to grow. Like this insane Keynesian idea that you need the money supply to continue to grow to keep up with the economy. If you're an intelligent engineer, you realize that's completely baseless. Why would you need the money supply to grow? So he made the money supply Austrian, not because I think he made money Austrian because he was a good engineer. He was smart, and he figured out that this would be the most way to make the money catch on. This would be the best way to get people to want to use this thing, and this would be the way to let it gain adoption. If you didn't have an army to go around and threaten to kill people if they don't use your money, you need to make your money the best money. And he arrived at the Austrian way of making money out of, I think, necessity and out of rational analysis rather than having been introduced to it from Rothbard and Mises.
And for one last question here, where do you see the broader cryptocurrency world moving in the near future?
Hopefully the broader cryptocurrency world continues its move downward. I think digital currencies other than Bitcoin are a bad thing. I think they're terrible because they are they are doomed, all of them. They are just simply products of hype. And the vast majority of them have gone to zero already. There's more than 22,000 existing currencies. There's been at least another 5,000 that have died over the past year. So the vast majority of these have gone to zero practically in Bitcoin terms already. And so the problem, of course, is that the ones that have not gone to zero are the ones that are the loudest, because they're the ones that are most centralized. They have the marketing teams behind them, and they make most people think that this is that you want to approach this thing like you approach stocks. You want to diversify in stocks because you don't just put all of your money in one company. You want to diversify. And so this, I think, has cost a lot of people a lot of money and ruined a lot of people's lives because they put their money into things that they don't understand, thinking is, it's just like Bitcoin. So you invest in Walmart and Pepsi and McDonald's, you diversify. Similarly, I'm going to invest in Bitcoin and Terra Luna and BitConnect and Ethereum and all these other horrible ideas. So I think the last year has been very, very bad for the broader cryptocurrency industry, particularly the non-Bitcoin part of the industry. It's been bad for Bitcoin, but Bitcoin's been through worse and has made it out, and its fundamentals are unaffected. Its main value proposition is still there. The money supply has not been increased. Nobody's been managed to change it. Nobody's managed to co-opt the network. But the value propositions for all the other coins have been massively impacted. Every 4 years we go through these cycles, and every 4 years we get a whole new bunch of buzzwords surrounding the digital currencies other than Bitcoin, where we're going to do this and we're going to do that, and it's going to be smart contracts or NFTs or ICOs or this or that or the other thing. It's all excuses for printing money. and it keeps getting discredited. And I think this last cycle was massively devastating for them. So hopefully it doesn't lead to a recovery, because I think, on top of the fact that individually a lot of people get ruined by them, I think it's also in a broader kind of collective way of looking at the impact that they have, is that they're distracting people away from Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is truly a way out of the fiat morass, and we found an exit from the slave plantation, and shitcoins are effectively like another plantation at the gate of the plantation, and instead of escaping, a lot of people are being lured into going into other slave plantations. So hopefully these plantations don't recover and don't thrive in the future. But I think with Bitcoin, I think it's the 4-year cyclical nature of Bitcoin seems to continue to hold up. For all of the talk about monetary policy affecting Bitcoin or so on, it's really the 4-year cycle of Bitcoin is still intact. We get the big rise after the halving, and then we get a big crash after that, and then people say Bitcoin's dead, and it's proceeding according to the same playbook. So I would not be surprised if we get another big rise in the next 2 years, and we replay the last 4 years all over again.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ammous, for being here with us today. Where can all the people here find you at?
My website, Saifedean.com, is my online independent learning platform where I teach courses in Austrian economics and the economics of Bitcoin. So you can sign up and become a member. I have 5 full courses that you can take at your own pace, and we have weekly seminars. And I'm on Twitter at Saifedean, and various other social media. My only handle is Saifedean. There's a bunch of impersonators who will message you and tell you to send them money. Don't fall for them. So at Saifedean is my only handle on any social media platform.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course.